In the spring of 1945, across the cities of Germany, millions of women woke up each morning and looked at the door. Some of them had not heard from their husbands in months. Some had received a single postcard or a letter with so much censored that the remaining words made no coherent sentence. Some had received nothing at all since Stalingrad. They had children to feed, buildings above their heads that no longer had roofs, and a government that had ceased to function, replaced by an occupying army that spoke a language they did not understand and carried with it a history of what it had done to the cities it passed through on the way here. The war ended on a specific date. For the wives of the men who fought it, on the losing side, it did not end. It transformed. The history of the Second World War has been written primarily in terms of armies and campaigns, of decisions made in command posts and conference rooms, of territory gained and lost, and the grand strategic logic that determined which nation emerged from the ruins with the power to define the post-war world. All of that history is real and consequential, but it accounts for perhaps half of the human population that lived through the war, and it accounts for them largely as background figures. The people who waited at home while history was made elsewhere, who wept when the telegrams arrived, who planted victory gardens and bought war bonds and kept the domestic machinery functioning while the men were away. The active participants, the ones history remembers. The women left behind in the defeated nations were not passive witnesses to the war's conclusion. They were the principal bearers of its consequences. Germany in May 1945 was not a country. It was a geographic area with approximately 65 million surviving inhabitants, no functioning government, no currency with reliable value, no intact transportation network, and an administrative structure that had been designed for a state that no longer existed. The cities, Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Frankfurt, were not damaged in the way that word usually implies. They were structurally destroyed. In Hamburg, British bombing raids in July 1943 had killed approximately 37,000 people in 10 days and destroyed around half the city's residential buildings. In Dresden, the raids of February 1945 had produced a firestorm that consumed the medieval center of the city entirely. Berlin, fought over street by street in April and May of 1945, was barely habitable. The population that remained in these cities was disproportionately composed of women, children, and the elderly. The men who might have evacuated or defended or organized were dead, captured, or still unaccounted for. The German military had produced over 6 years of war, approximately 18 million soldiers. By the time the war ended, roughly 5.3 million of them were dead, and approximately 11 million were in Allied captivity. The remainder were somewhere between wounded, displaced, moving through a landscape that no longer had a functional state to receive them. What this meant at the household level was a specific, calculable form of uncertainty. Millions of German women did not know whether their husbands were alive. The German military's administrative capacity had collapsed along with everything else. Notifications of death, already unreliable, had ceased entirely in the final months. A woman whose husband had been at the Eastern Front in March 1945 might have received no communication since January. She had no way to know whether he had been killed, captured, surrendered, or was walking west through what had been Poland, trying to reach a zone that was not Soviet. This uncertainty was formalized into a bureaucratic category, vermisst, missing. At the end of 1945, roughly 1.3 million German soldiers were officially listed as missing. The true number was considerably higher, because the records were in chaos and the agencies responsible for maintaining them were operating in cities that had been bombed flat. A woman listed as vermisste Frau, the wife of a missing man, occupied a specific legal limbo. She could not remarry, she could not claim a widow's pension, she could not access certain forms of property held jointly with her husband. She was suspended between two statuses, wife and widow, and the suspension could last for years. For many women, it lasted a decade. The final German prisoners of war held by the Soviet Union were not repatriated until 1955, a full 10 years after the war ended. The men who returned from Soviet captivity had spent that decade in labor camps in Siberia, Kazakhstan, and across the former Soviet Union under conditions of extreme deprivation. Of the approximately 3.1 million German soldiers captured by the Soviets, roughly 1.1 million did not survive captivity. The others came home in installments, in groups, over years, to a country and to wives and to children who had lived an entire decade without them, and who, in many cases, had ceased in any practical sense to need them. The man who walked through the door in 1953 or 1954 was a stranger to his own family, physically diminished, psychologically altered, returning to a domestic structure that had been rebuilt entirely around his absence. The consequences of that specific rupture were not discussed publicly in West Germany for decades. But the physical circumstances of 1945 did not wait for that reckoning. In the spring and summer of that year, and survival was the organizing principle of every decision made by every woman in the defeated nation, and survival required confronting conditions that no domestic management had prepared anyone for. The Soviet advance through Eastern Germany in the final months of the war was accompanied by a scale of sexual violence against the civilian population that remains one of the most extensively documented and least publicly acknowledged war crimes of the 20th century. Soviet soldiers raped German women in systematic fashion across the territories they occupied, from East Prussia through Pomerania, Silesia, and into Berlin itself. Estimates of the total number of victims range from 1.4 million to 2 million women, with figures for Berlin alone ranging from 95,000 to over 130,000 during the weeks of the city's conquest and occupation. The German doctor Ingeborg Jacobs, writing later about her clinical work in Berlin in the summer of 1945, noted that the Berlin hospital where she worked performed thousands of abortions in 1945 and 1946. Almost all on women who had been raped. The Soviet military command issued formal prohibitions against rape, multiple times, which is itself an indication of how effective those prohibitions were. The women who survived this did so largely in silence. In the Soviet occupation zone, which became East Germany, the subject was politically prohibited. Speaking of Soviet atrocities was a crime. In West Germany, the silence was cultural and psychological. The shame attached to rape in 1945 fell on the victims, and many women carried the experience without ever disclosing it to family members, to doctors, or to the men who eventually returned. Anonyma, the anonymous account published in German in 1954 and translated decades later, gave the first sustained public documentation of what the occupation of Berlin had meant for its women, written in the form of a diary by a woman who recorded the daily arithmetic of survival. Food obtained, rapes endured, decisions made about which man to attach oneself to for protection, which Soviet officers' patronage could provide the margin between eating and not eating. The book was condemned by German critics when it appeared. It was described as shameless. It was withdrawn from print and not republished until 2003. The physical reconstruction of German cities was performed in large part by women. The Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, have been commemorated in stone and bronze in several German cities, and the commemoration contains a certain amount of mythologizing, as commemorations tend to do. The reality was that women formed the majority of the available labor force in German cities in 1945 and 1946, and the work of clearing bombed-out streets so that buildings could eventually be rebuilt fell to them because there was no one else. In Berlin, approximately 60,000 women registered for the rubble-clearing brigades in the summer of 1945. They were paid in food, a specific direct transaction, labor exchange for calories, the most elementary form of economic relationship. The rubble they cleared was not an abstraction. It contained the structural remains of buildings that had been apartments and churches and schools. Oh, and it also contained, in quantities that were not publicly quantified, the fragmentary remains of the people who had been inside them when the buildings came down. The food situation in Germany in 1945 and 1946 was, in technical terms, a famine condition in several regions. The official Allied ration in the British zone in the winter of 1946 to 47 was 1,050 calories per day, approximately half the caloric minimum required for a sedentary adult, and significantly less than what the work of physical reconstruction demanded. Infant mortality in Berlin in 1945 was reported by contemporary observers as catastrophic. The black market, which was less a market than the only functional distribution system, required goods to trade, and the women who managed it traded whatever they had: clothing, jewelry, furniture, and the physical remnants of domestic life. The German currency, the Reichsmark, had collapsed to a value where it was used primarily as fuel for heating, rather than as a medium of exchange. The American cigarette became the dominant store of value and medium of exchange in Western Germany, and a woman's ability to navigate this economy, to understand its hierarchies, to identify reliable trading partners, to calculate exchange ratios, was the difference between a family that ate and one that did not. The Japanese experience was structurally parallel, but geographically concentrated, and culturally distinct in ways that shaped how it was endured and how it was remembered. Japan's military had mobilized approximately 9 million men over the course of the war, and the defeat in August 1945 left approximately 3.5 million Japanese soldiers and military personnel stranded outside the home islands, in China, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific, in Manchuria, and critically, in Soviet captivity. The Soviet Union, which had declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945, 2 days after Hiroshima and 1 day before Nagasaki, swept through Manchuria in the final days of the war and captured approximately 575,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians. These prisoners were transported to labor camps across the Soviet Union, where they were held for years. Repatriation was gradual and partial. Some prisoners were not returned until the mid-1950s. A small number remained, officially unaccounted for, into the 1960s. Nari, the Japanese wife waiting for a husband who had been in Manchuria, occupied the same bureaucratic limbo as her German counterpart, with the additional dimension of Japan's own material destruction. The firebombing campaign against Japanese cities in 1945 had been, in aggregate, as devastating as the atomic bombs. The March 1945 firebombing of Tokyo killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night and destroyed approximately 16 square miles of the city. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities had been systematically reduced. The women who remained in these cities, who had survived the bombings, many who had lost homes and possessions and family members, faced a reconstruction problem on the same scale as Germany, but with less Allied material assistance and within a culture where the expression of distress was contained by norms of stoic endurance that had been explicitly cultivated as a war psychology. The occupation of Japan by American forces was fundamentally different in character from the Soviet occupation of Eastern Germany. It was controlled, institutionally managed, and deliberately non-punitive at the civilian level, but it produced its own dynamics. The proximity of American servicemen to Japanese women in the occupation years generated a social phenomenon that Japanese society processed with considerable difficulty. The fraternization and sexual relationships between occupiers and occupied, and the children born of those relationships. The women who navigated the occupation economy as entertainers and companions in ways that gave them access to food, goods, and material security, but that placed them outside the social categories available to respectable Japanese women. The official Japanese government policy toward these relationships and toward the children they produced was exclusion. The mixed-race children of the occupation years were systematically denied Japanese citizenship, schooling, and social integration. Their mothers occupied a social space that Japanese society had no established framework for accommodating. Across Italy, the picture was fragmented by Italy's own fragmented experience of the war. The country had changed sides in 1943, which meant that Italian soldiers had been fighting for opposing powers at different points in the conflict, that Italian civilians had been occupied by Germans and then liberated by Allies, that the country's political and social landscape at war's end was a layered accumulation of competing loyalties and mutual recriminations. The wives of Italian soldiers who had served in the German aligned forces and survived faced a specific post-war social pressure. The wives of the 650,000 Italian soldiers interned by Germany after the armistice of 1943, the Internati Militari Italiani, had spent 2 years in a similar uncertainty to their German and Japanese counterparts, uncertain whether their husbands were alive, in what conditions, whether they would return. The Italian state was in no condition to provide systematic support. What all of these women shared, across the geographic and cultural distance between their circumstances, was a relationship to the same fundamental problem. The war had removed the structural assumption on which their lives had been built, had been organized, had in many cases been legally and economically defined. The assumption that a husband existed, that he was present or would return, that the household had a functioning head. The legal systems of Germany, Japan, and Italy in 1945 had been designed around male household authority. Property rights, pension rights, the rights of children. All of these ran through the husband in ways that his absence or death or uncertain status immediately disrupted. The women who managed these disruptions did so without institutional support, largely without public acknowledgement, and in most cases without the vocabulary to describe their experience as anything other than a private difficulty. The balance sheet of what the war produced in the lives of these women is not a simple document. Some of them developed capabilities, economic, organizational, psychological, that the pre-war social structure had not required them to develop and would not have permitted them to exercise. The Trümmerfrauen of Berlin, the women who managed black market economies in Hamburg, the Japanese women who navigated the occupation, with a pragmatism that their culture's official norms did not endorse. All of these built competencies out of necessity that in a different world might have been called strengths. The post-war economic recoveries of Germany and Japan both depended, in their early phases, on the labor and organizational capacity of women, working in conditions of extreme constraint. But what was gained in capability was paid for in ways that were not recorded and not compensated. The physical violence of the occupation, the years of uncertainty, the legal limbo, the children raised without fathers, the husbands who returned from captivity changed beyond recognition, and the households that had reorganized themselves around absence and then had to reorganize again around a difficult presence. None of this was acknowledged by the states that succeeded the defeated regimes. None of it was quantified or compensated or officially mourned. The defeated nation conducted its mourning for its soldiers. It did not conduct a parallel mourning for what its soldiers' wives had carried in the years that followed. The silence was not accidental. A nation rebuilding its identity after catastrophic defeat needed a usable past, a version of the war years that permitted forward movement without permanently disabling self-regard. Germany founded in the economic miracle of the 1950s. Japan founded in Reconstruction and the technology-driven growth of the post-war decades. In both cases, the story told about the war emphasized sacrifice and endurance and eventual recovery. And in both cases, the specific experiences of women in the occupation years fit uncomfortably into that story. They were too close to defeat, too implicated in the mechanisms by which defeat was survived. What those women had done in 1945 and 1946 and 1947 was not heroic in the official sense. It was necessary and often ugly, and it was performed without choice. Now we have built memorials to the soldiers. The rubble women of Berlin have their statue. The rest remains mostly in the diaries and the letters and the clinical records and the testimonies taken decades later by historians who understood that the war had a second history running parallel to the first, and that it had been conducted by people who did not appear in the official archive. The door that millions of women looked at each morning in 1945 eventually stopped being something they waited in front of. Life organized itself around the space where the expected return had not arrived. Cities were rebuilt. Children grew up. The economies recovered and the decades passed, and the women who had carried the weight of the defeat grew old in countries that had found ways to move past what had happened.